When successful lawyer Rachel Hayes laughed at janitor David Cross and mockingly said, "Translate this and my salary is yours." She had no idea she was speaking to a former international law professor whose hidden brilliance would expose a deadly money laundering scheme and save her entire career. But David's greatest secret wasn't his education. It was the heartbreaking reason he'd traded his professor's podium for a janitor's mop. The fluorescent lights of Morrison, Hayes and Associates hummed their familiar tune as David Cross pushed his cleaning cart down the marble-floored corridor. At 42, his hands bore the rough calluses of countless nights spent scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once commanded respect in university lecture halls, still held an intelligence that the custodial uniform couldn't quite conceal. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday in October, and the law firm's 23rd floor should have been empty. But as David approached the main conference room, he could hear raised voices and the sharp clatter of papers being shuffled with frustrated urgency. Through the glass walls, he saw them 6 of the firm's top attorneys huddled around an enormous mahogany table, their expensive suits wrinkled from hours of stress, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of laptop screens. At the head of the table sat Rachel Hayes, the firm's youngest senior partner at 34. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her emerald eyes flashed with the kind of ambition that had propelled her from a modest background in Ohio to the pinnacle of Manhattan's legal elite. She was beautiful in that sharp, untouchable way that came from years of fighting to be taken seriously in a male-dominated profession. "This is a disaster." Rachel's voice cut through the glass like a blade. "Absolutely unacceptable." David hesitated at the door. Protocol dictated that he should return later, but something in the tension radiating from the room made him pause. In his previous life, the life before everything fell apart, he had learned to read the subtle signs of legal crisis, and this, he could tell, was a crisis of epic proportions. He knocked softly and pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. "Excuse me, should I come back later to clean?" 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him with varying degrees of irritation. Rachel barely glanced up from the documents scattered before her. "Just quietly. We're in the middle of something critical here." David nodded and wheeled his cart into the corner, moving with the practiced invisibility that had become second nature over the past 3 years. As he began emptying wastebaskets, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation unfolding around the table. "The Russian delegation is arriving in 4 hours. Said James Morrison, the firm's founding partner, a silver-haired man whose reputation for handling international deals was legendary. 4 hours, and we still can't make heads or tails of these documents. I've called every translator in the city," added Sarah Chen, a brilliant corporate attorney whose normally composed demeanor was cracking under pressure. "It's past midnight. No one's available until morning, and that's too late." David's hands stilled on the trash bin as he recognized the familiar Cyrillic script scattered across the papers. His heart began to race, not with excitement, but with a complex mixture of longing and pain. Those letters, those words, they belonged to a world he had once inhabited with confidence and expertise. "What exactly are we dealing with?" asked Michael Torres, the firm's litigation specialist, loosening his tie in frustration. Rachel slammed her palm against the table, causing coffee cups to rattle. "A potential $50 million merger between Volkov Industries and Henderson Corp. The contracts are entirely in Russian, and our client needs them translated and analyzed before dawn. If we can't deliver, Henderson walks away from the biggest deal this firm has ever handled." "Can't we use Google Translate?" suggested Amanda Price, the newest associate, immediately regretting her words as 6 sets of eyes fixed on her with withering stares. "Google Translate." Rachel's voice dripped with sarcasm. "For a $50 million contract involving international mining rights and complex subsidiary structures, Amanda, this isn't a restaurant menu we're trying to decode." David continued his work, but every instinct honed by years of academic training was screaming at him. The documents he glimpsed weren't standard merger paperwork. The terminology, the structure, the suspicious gaps in disclosure, something was deeply wrong. "Maybe we should postpone," suggested Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the firm's international law consultant. Explain the situation to Henderson. They'll understand. No. Rachel's voice was steel. Henderson has 3 other firms bidding for their business. If we can't handle this, they'll move on and Morrison, Hayes and Associates will lose the most lucrative client in our history. James Morrison ran his hands through his silver hair, looking every one of his 68 years. My grandfather built this firm on the principle that we never say impossible, but I'm starting to think there has to be someone. Rachel interrupted, her voice rising with desperation that she was trying hard to conceal. Someone in this city who can translate Russian legal documents at this hour. It was then that Viktor Petrov spoke up. David had been so focused on the familiar faces of the firm's attorneys that he hadn't noticed the 6th person at the table, a man in his 50s with steel gray hair, cold blue eyes, and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted its price tag. He had been sitting quietly in the shadows, observing the mounting panic with what appeared to be amusement. Perhaps, Victor said in accented English, his voice carrying the weight of authority, this is a sign that fate does not favor this partnership. Rachel whirled on him. Mr. Petrov, with all due respect, Volkov Industries came to us. Your company requested this expedited timeline. We're doing everything in our power to meet your demands. Victor's smile was thin and cold. Of course. But in Russia we have a saying, Tot kto ne может читать контракт, не должен его подписывать. He paused, his eyes glittering with something that might have been malice. Those who cannot read a contract should not sign it. The room fell silent. David's blood ran cold as the Russian words hit him like a physical blow. Not because he didn't understand them, quite the opposite. He understood them perfectly, along with their implications. But there was something else. Something in Victor's tone and the slight emphasis on certain words that triggered every alarm bell in David's mind. What did he just say? Amanda whispered. Nothing helpful. Rachel snapped her composure, finally beginning to crack. Look, we're all exhausted. We're all frustrated, but there has to be a solution. Michael Torres stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm calling every international law firm in the city. Someone has to have a Russian speaker on call. You think we haven't tried that? Sarah Chen's voice was sharp with exhaustion. It's the middle of the night, Michael. Even if we found someone, they'd need hours to review documents this complex. David found himself moving closer to the table, his trained eye catching glimpses of the paperwork. What he saw made his stomach clench with a familiar dread. The terminology was wrong, subtly dangerously wrong. These weren't standard merger documents. They were something else entirely disguised with just enough legitimate language to fool someone without deep expertise in Russian corporate law. Maybe the janitor can help, Victor said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension with casual cruelty. Perhaps he knows some Russian from the old movies, duh. The attorneys looked at David with mixtures of embarrassment and annoyance, as if his presence had suddenly become an inconvenience. Rachel's cheeks flushed red. Mr. Petrov, that's hardly, she began. Actually, Victor continued, clearly enjoying himself. Maybe the cleaning man can solve all our problems. Russians and Americans working together like the good old days of the Cold War. The laughter that erupted from the table was nervous, uncomfortable, but Rachel's was different. Hers carried an edge of hysteria, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. Yes, she said, her voice rising with a manic energy that made David's heart sink. Maybe the janitor can solve our translation problem too. Why not? We're clearly out of options here. The room went quiet. David felt 6 pairs of eyes on him, some embarrassed, some amused, but Rachel's burning with a mixture of desperation and spite that cut deeper than she probably intended. I mean, seriously, Rachel continued, her voice gaining momentum as exhaustion and stress stripped away her professional facade. We've got Harvard MBAs, Yale law degrees, decades of international experience, and we can't handle a simple translation. Maybe we should ask the cleaning staff. Maybe they're secretly running this place and we just haven't figured it out yet. Rachel, James Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a warning. But Rachel was beyond listening. 3 years of 16-hour days of fighting for respect in a profession that still questioned women's capabilities of sacrificing personal relationships for professional advancement. It all came pouring out in a torrent of bitter sarcasm. No, I'm serious. We're sitting here like idiots about to lose the biggest client in the firm's history, and maybe the answer has been right in front of us this whole time. Maybe the janitor speaks perfect Russian. Maybe he's got a PhD in international law hidden under that uniform. David's hands had stopped moving entirely. The cleaning cloth hung forgotten in his grip as Rachel's words hit him like physical blows. Every instinct told him to retreat, to disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. But something else, something deeper and more powerful, was stirring within him. It was his daughter's face that appeared in his mind. Emma, 7 years old, with her mother's golden hair and his own brown eyes, lying in a hospital bed at New York Presbyterian. Emma, who trusted him completely to find a way to pay for the experimental treatment that might save her life. Emma, who still believed her daddy was the smartest man in the world, even though she couldn't understand why he came home smelling like disinfectant instead of books. You know what? Rachel's voice had reached a fever pitch. I'll make this interesting. Translate this mess. She gestured wildly at the documents. And my entire salary is yours. Every penny of what I make in a year. Because if you can do what 6 of Manhattan's top attorneys can't, then clearly you deserve it more than we do. The silence that followed was deafening. David could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been Dr. David Cross, professor of international law at Columbia University, specializing in Eastern European legal systems and Russian corporate structures. He had spoken 4 languages, fluently published papers in prestigious journals, and commanded the respect of colleagues worldwide. Then came the diagnosis. Emma's rare genetic condition, the staggering medical bills, the insurance company's refusal to cover experimental treatments. The choice between his career and his daughter's life hadn't really been a choice at all. Now, as Rachel's mocking words hung in the air like a challenge, David felt something shifting inside him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of 3 years of invisibility, of being dismissed and overlooked and treated as less than human. He set down his cleaning cloth and turned to face the table. "I'll take that bet," he said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread across the room. Rachel's mouth fell open. The other attorneys looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Viktor Petrov's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since David had entered the room, he looked genuinely interested. "Excuse me." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. David stepped closer to the table, his movements deliberate and calm. Years of standing before lecture halls had taught him how to command attention, and that skill hadn't entirely abandoned him. "You offered your salary to anyone who could translate these documents," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm accepting your offer." "This is ridiculous," Michael Torres said, half rising from his chair. "David, I appreciate. Let him speak," Victor interrupted, his accented voice cutting through the protests. There was something different in his tone now, something watchful and alert. "I am curious to see what the janitor has to say." David reached for the nearest stack of documents, his hands surprisingly steady. The Cyrillic letters seemed to leap off the page, as familiar and comfortable as old friends. But as his eyes scanned the text, his expression grew increasingly grim. "These aren't standard merger documents," he said, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a knife. Rachel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, really? And how exactly would you know?" "Because," David interrupted, his eyes still fixed on the papers, "this isn't a merger at all. It's a money laundering operation disguised as a corporate partnership." The room erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as attorneys leaned forward. Viktor Petrov went very still, his blue eyes fixed on David with laser intensity. "That's impossible," Sarah Chen said. "We've reviewed these documents for weeks." "In English translation," David said, finally looking up from the papers. "Incomplete English translation that was deliberately designed to obscure the real purpose of these agreements." He turned to face Victor directly, and when he spoke it was in fluent Russian, his accent carrying the precision of years of academic study. «Вы думали, что никто не поймет, что вы пытаетесь отмыть деньги через подставную компанию?» You thought no one would understand that you're trying to launder money through a shell company. Victor's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of surprise, and something darker crossing his features before he regained control. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said in English, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. David picked up another document, his movements precise and professional. This section here, which was translated as subsidiary management structure, actually establishes a series of shell companies in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. The money flows through Henderson Corp into Volkov Industries, then gets dispersed through at least 6 different offshore accounts before disappearing entirely. That's not possible, James Morrison said, his face pale. We had these translated by someone who was either incompetent or complicit, David said. The real question is whether Henderson Corp knows what they're signing or if they're being set up as unwitting accomplices. Rachel had gone completely white. You're saying we were about to help facilitate a massive money laundering scheme, David confirmed. Probably tied to Russian organized crime, given the specific terminology and structure used in these documents. Victor stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward. This is absurd. Wild accusations from a former professor of international law at Columbia University, David said calmly. Specializing in Eastern European legal systems and Russian corporate crime structures. Dr. David Cross, if you'd like to verify my credentials. The silence that followed was profound. 6 attorneys stared at David as if seeing him for the first time, their minds struggling to reconcile the janitor they thought they knew with the man standing before them. It was Rachel who found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. Professor Cross. David nodded, his expression sad but resolute. I was, before life, required different choices. But why? She began, then stopped, perhaps realizing that the question was more personal than professional. Medical bills, David said simply. My daughter needs treatment that insurance won't cover. Night custodial work pays better than adjunct teaching, and the flexible schedule allows me to be with her during the day. The revelation hung in the air like a confession. Around the table, David could see the wheels turning in 6 brilliant legal minds, processing not just the information about the documents, but the profound implications of what had just happened. They had been moments away from facilitating a crime that could have destroyed their careers and possibly landed them in federal prison. And they had been saved by the man they had dismissed, mocked, and ignored. Viktor Petrov was backing toward the door, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. This meeting is over, he said, his accent thicker now with stress. Volkov Industries withdraws from all negotiations. Actually, David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I don't think you'll be withdrawing. I think you'll be staying right here while we call the FBI. You cannot prove anything, Victor snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. These are legitimate business documents. Statya 174.1 Ugolovного Kodeksa Российской Федерации, David said, in rapid Russian. Legalizatsiya денежных средств, полученных преступным путем. Article 174.1 of the Russian Criminal Code, money laundering. The penalties in the United States are even more severe, especially when they involve organized crime. Victor's face had gone ashen. Whatever composure he had maintained was crumbling as he realized that his carefully constructed deception had been completely unraveled by a man he had dismissed as beneath his notice. Sarah, James Morrison said, his voice sharp with command. Call building security. Make sure Mr. Petrov doesn't leave the floor. Already on it, Sarah said, her phone pressed to her ear. Michael, get the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit on the line. Elena, start documenting everything, every conversation, every document, every communication we've had with Volkov Industries. As the attorneys sprang into action around him, David felt a strange sense of displacement. For 3 years, he had been invisible in this world, moving through it, like a ghost. Now suddenly, he was at the center of everything, his expertise, the key that had unlocked a conspiracy that could have destroyed them all. Rachel approached him slowly, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been shame. Professor Cross, she began, then stopped, shaking her head. David, I owe you an apology. What I said, how I treated you, it was inexcusable. David looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the sharp suit and carefully constructed facade to the exhausted, frightened woman beneath. You were under pressure, he said simply. People say things they don't mean when they're desperate. That's not an excuse, Rachel said firmly. I was cruel and I was wrong, and you had every right to let us walk into that trap. Why didn't you? Why did you help us? David was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Around them, the conference room buzzed with activity as attorneys made phone calls, secured documents, and prepared for what would undoubtedly be a very long night dealing with federal investigators. Because, he said finally, 3 years ago when my world fell apart, I learned something important. We're all just people trying to do our best with impossible circumstances. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes we're cruel or stupid or scared. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a chance to do the right thing, even when it costs us something. Rachel's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. Your salary, she said suddenly. I meant what I said. You saved us. You saved our careers, our reputations, possibly our freedom. That's worth more than money, but I don't want your salary, David said gently. But there is something you could do for me. Anything. David glanced around the room at the attorneys working frantically to contain the crisis he had helped them avoid. These were brilliant people, driven and successful, but they were also human. Flawed, frightened, and capable of both cruelty and kindness. Help me find a way back, he said quietly. I don't know if it's possible, but I miss this world. I miss using my mind for more than calculating which cleaning supplies are most cost-effective. I miss being Dr. Cross instead of just David the janitor. Rachel's response was immediate and fierce. Consider it done. As federal agents began arriving and the investigation into Volkov Industries began in earnest, David found himself thinking about Emma sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed 12 blocks away. Tomorrow, he would tell her that Daddy had had an important meeting at work and that things might be changing soon. He wouldn't tell her about the mockery or the humiliation or the moment when his old life had crashed back into his new one with devastating force. He would simply tell her that sometimes when you've lost everything that matters, the universe gives you a chance to find it again if you're brave enough to reach for it. The night was far from over, and David knew that the real challenges were just beginning. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like Professor Cross again, brilliant, capable, and worthy of respect. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, and one he wasn't willing to lose again. As Viktor Petrov was led away in handcuffs, and the FBI began their investigation into what would become one of the largest money laundering cases in recent history, David Cross, janitor, father, and professor, began to believe that redemption might be possible after all. The mockery that had started the night had transformed into something else entirely, a second chance at the life he thought he had lost forever. The fluorescent lights seemed different now, casting sharper shadows across the conference room as FBI agents methodically documented every piece of evidence. David watched from the corner where his cleaning cart still sat abandoned, a strange relic from what felt like another lifetime. Special Agent Catherine Martinez had arrived 20 minutes earlier with a team of financial crimes investigators, transforming the elegant boardroom into a bustling command center. Professor Cross. Agent Martinez approached him with a respectful nod, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. I've reviewed your preliminary assessment of the documents. Your analysis was extraordinary. We've been tracking Volkov Industries for 18 months without making this connection. David felt the familiar weight of academic responsibility settling on his shoulders, like an old coat. The pattern was subtle but consistent. They were using legitimate merger terminology to mask what was essentially a sophisticated layering operation. Money comes in through Henderson Corp's mining ventures, gets shuffled through the shell companies in Cyprus, then emerges clean through Caribbean subsidiaries. How much are we talking about? Agent Martinez asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Conservative estimate, $200 million over the next fiscal year. But this is clearly an established operation. I'd guess they've already moved at least $500 million through similar arrangements. Rachel, who had been listening from across the room, walked over to join them. Her earlier hostility had been replaced by something David couldn't quite identify. Respect, certainly, but also a kind of desperate curiosity. "Agent Martinez," she said, "Professor Cross hasn't worked in the legal field for 3 years. How is it that he spotted something our entire team missed?" The agent glanced between them, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Experience with this specific type of crime, I'd imagine. Professor Cross, your background is in Russian corporate law, Eastern European legal systems with a focus on organized crime structures," David confirmed. "I spent 6 years researching how legitimate businesses get co-opted by criminal organizations. Published extensively on the subject before—" He paused, glancing at Rachel. "Before circumstances changed." James Morrison approached their small group, his face haggard with exhaustion and stress. At 68, he had weathered countless legal storms, but tonight had shaken him to his core. "Professor Cross," he said formally, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. If you hadn't been here tonight, if you hadn't spoken up, this firm would have been destroyed. Our reputations, our careers possibly, our freedom, all of it would have been gone by morning." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Morrison," David replied quietly. "I was just doing what was right." "No," Morrison said firmly. "You were doing far more than that. You saved us from our own arrogance." His eyes shifted to encompass the other attorneys in the room. "We had all the pieces right in front of us, but we were so focused on the financial aspects that we missed the criminal ones. It took someone with your specific expertise to see what we couldn't." Sarah Chen had been quietly working on her laptop in the corner, but now she looked up with an expression of dawning realization. "The timing," she said suddenly. "Viktor Petrov insisted on the midnight meeting. He wanted us exhausted, desperate, willing to overlook details we might normally catch." "Exactly." David nodded. "Classic manipulation tactic. Create artificial urgency, apply pressure, then present a solution that seems reasonable under the circumstances. By the time you realized what you'd signed, the money would already be moving through the system." Agent Martinez made more notes, then looked up at David with professional interest. "We're going to need your continued assistance with this investigation. Your expertise could be invaluable in understanding the full scope of their operation." David felt his heart rate quicken. For 3 years, his intellectual capabilities had been reduced to calculating cleaning schedules and inventory management. The prospect of using his mind for something meaningful again was intoxicating. "I'd be happy to help," he said, "but I should mention that my availability is limited. I have other responsibilities." Rachel's expression shifted, reminding David that she still knew nothing about the real reason for his career change. The weight of Emma's situation pressed down on him like a physical force. In a few hours, he would need to be at the hospital for her morning treatment session, pretending that everything was normal, while his daughter underwent another round of experimental therapy that was slowly draining his savings. "What kind of responsibilities?" Agent Martinez asked. David hesitated. His personal life had been private for so long that discussing it felt like exposing a wound. But something about the events of the night had changed him, made him feel less like he needed to hide. "I have a 7-year-old daughter who's undergoing medical treatment," he said simply. "She needs me during the day, which is why I work nights." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. David could see the attorneys processing this information, their brilliant minds connecting dots he wasn't sure he was ready to have connected. It was Dr. Elena Rodriguez who spoke first, her voice gentle with understanding. "That must be incredibly difficult, balancing a sick child with work responsibilities." "It's the most important thing in my life," David said firmly. "Everything else, career, reputation, financial security, none of it matters if I can't take care of Emma." Rachel's face had gone pale. "Is that why you left Columbia? Your daughter's illness?" David nodded, not trusting his voice. The memory of that decision, walking away from tenure, from research he loved, from a life he had spent years building, still cut deep. "What kind of treatment is she receiving?" Dr. Rodriguez asked professionally. As the firm's international law consultant, she had handled numerous medical malpractice cases and understood the complexities of specialized care. Experimental gene therapy for a rare mitochondrial disorder, David explained. The treatment isn't covered by insurance and the clinical trials have waiting lists years long. Private treatment was the only option. Agent Martinez looked up from her notepad, her expression thoughtful. Professor Cross, I don't mean to pry, but are you aware that the FBI has a consultant program for academic experts? The compensation is substantial, and the schedule can be quite flexible. David's heart skipped. I wasn't aware of that program. Financial Crimes Division specifically. We work with professors, former prosecutors, forensic accountants, people with specialized knowledge that helps us understand complex criminal operations. The work would be similar to what you did tonight, but on a regular basis. Rachel stepped forward eagerly. Agent Martinez, I'd like to make a formal recommendation. Professor Cross's analysis tonight was nothing short of brilliant. His expertise could benefit not just the FBI, but also firms like ours who deal with international transactions. What are you suggesting? Morrison asked. A consulting arrangement. Rachel said, her words coming faster as the idea took shape. Professor Cross could work with us on complex international cases, particularly those involving Eastern European entities. The firm could provide a retainer that would give him financial stability while allowing him the flexibility to care for his daughter. David stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Rachel, I appreciate the thought, but no, hear me out, she insisted. Tonight proved that we need expertise we don't currently have in-house. You could work from wherever you needed to be, consult on cases as your schedule permits, and earn compensation that reflects your actual value, rather than... She gestured toward his custodial uniform. Morrison was nodding slowly. It's not without precedent. We've had similar arrangements with forensic accountants, medical experts, technology consultants. The question is whether Professor Cross would be interested in such an arrangement. The room had grown quiet except for the low murmur of FBI agents working in the background. David felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him waiting for his response. But his mind was already racing ahead to Emma, to the treatment schedules that kept him awake at night, to the mounting medical bills that seemed to grow faster than he could pay them. I'd need to maintain my current schedule during Emma's treatment hours, he said carefully. Morning sessions at the hospital, afternoon recovery time at home. I could work evenings and weekends and be available for emergency consultations by phone or video. Absolutely doable, Morrison said immediately. Professor Cross, I want to be clear about something. This isn't charity. What you did tonight saved this firm from catastrophe. Your expertise has genuine commercial value, and we'd be fortunate to have access to it. Agent Martinez cleared her throat. Before you make any commitments to private consulting Professor Cross, I'd like you to consider the FBI position as well. The cases we work on have national security implications. Tonight's discovery about Volkov Industries is just the tip of the iceberg. We believe they're part of a larger network that's been operating for years. David felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of intellectual challenge. What kind of network? Russian organized crime syndicate with tentacles throughout Eastern Europe and increasingly in North America. They use legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking. Your expertise in their legal structures could help us dismantle operations that have been hidden for decades. The magnitude of what Agent Martinez was describing hit David like a physical blow. This wasn't just about catching one corrupt businessman. It was about taking down a criminal enterprise that was causing real harm to real people. How many people are we talking about? He asked quietly. Thousands, potentially. The human trafficking alone. Agent Martinez paused, her professional composure slipping slightly. Let's just say that stopping operations like this saves lives. David thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed, trusting him to make the right choices for her future. But he also thought about other children who might be trapped in situations far worse than anything his daughter would ever face. I'd like to help, he said finally. Both with the FBI investigation and with Morrison, Hayes & Associates, if the scheduling can work around Emma's needs. Rachel's smile was brilliant with relief, and something else, redemption perhaps, for the cruelty she had shown earlier. We'll make it work, Professor Cross. Whatever you need. David, he corrected gently. After tonight, I think we can use first names. Agent Martinez was making more notes. Excellent. I'll have the paperwork for the FBI consultant position prepared by tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, I'd like you to review the complete Volkov Industries file. There are patterns in their previous transactions that we haven't been able to decode. I can start on that tomorrow evening, David said, after Emma's treatment session. Dr. Rodriguez had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up with careful delicacy. David, if you don't mind me asking, what's your daughter's prognosis? With the experimental treatment, I mean. David's throat tightened. This was the question that kept him awake at night, the uncertainty that made every financial decision feel like a gamble with Emma's life. The doctors are cautiously optimistic, he said. The gene therapy is showing promise in clinical trials, but Emma's case is complicated by some secondary conditions. The treatment protocol is expected to take another 18 months, possibly longer. And the cost? Morrison asked bluntly, his business instincts cutting straight to the practical concerns. About $30,000 per month for the specialized therapy plus associated medical costs. Insurance covers maybe 20%. David's voice was steady, but Rachel could see the strain in his eyes. I've been managing, but it's been challenging. The room was quiet as the attorneys processed this information. $30,000 per month was more than many people made in a year, yet David had been covering it on a janitor's salary supplemented by whatever freelance academic work he could find. How, Sarah Chen asked softly, how have you been managing costs like that? David was quiet for a long moment. Sold everything I owned of value, mortgaged and remortgaged my apartment, took on additional cleaning contracts at other buildings. Emma doesn't know how bad things have gotten financially. She just knows that Daddy has to work a lot to pay for her medicine. Rachel felt something twist in her chest. The man she had mocked and dismissed had been fighting a battle that would have broken most people, and he had done it without complaint, without asking for help, without letting his circumstances diminish his fundamental decency. The consultant fees we're discussing, Morrison said carefully, would be substantial enough to cover those medical expenses and provide financial stability besides. That's very generous, but I want to be clear, David said firmly. I'm not looking for charity. I want to earn my compensation through the value of my work. Professor Cross. David, Agent Martinez interjected, let me be completely frank. The expertise you demonstrated tonight is rare and valuable. The FBI has been trying to penetrate Russian financial crime networks for years without success. Your academic background combined with your ability to read the subtleties in their documentation makes you uniquely qualified to help us understand how these operations work. She paused, consulting her notes. The consulting fees for someone with your qualifications typically range from $500 to $800 per hour for specialized financial crime analysis. Even part-time work would provide substantial income. David felt dizzy. Numbers like that hadn't been part of his reality for so long that they seemed almost fictional. That's considerably more than I was expecting. It's what the work is worth, Morrison said simply. David, I've been practicing law for 45 years. What you did tonight, the speed and accuracy with which you identified not just the translation errors, but the underlying criminal pattern, that's the kind of expertise that can't be taught. It comes from years of deep academic study combined with practical experience. Rachel stepped closer, her voice earnest. David, I want to apologize again for what I said earlier, but I also want you to know that my offer about your salary, I meant it. Not as charity, but as recognition that what you've contributed tonight is worth more than any of us make in a year. I don't want your salary, Rachel, David said gently. But I would appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you on a professional basis. It's been 3 years since I've been able to use my mind for something meaningful, and I'd forgotten how much I missed it. Agent Martinez closed her notepad. I'll need a complete background check, obviously, but that's routine for consultant positions. Given your academic credentials and tonight's demonstration of your capabilities, I don't anticipate any issues. There's one more thing, David said, his voice becoming more serious. If I'm going to be working on cases involving Russian organized crime, there could be security implications. I need to know that Emma will be safe. The weight of this consideration settled over the room like a cold blanket. In all the excitement about David's expertise and the potential consulting arrangements, none of them had fully considered the risks involved in taking on criminal organizations with international reach. That's a legitimate concern, Agent Martinez acknowledged. We have protocols for protecting consultants and their families when necessary. It's not common for these groups to target academic consultants, but we take the safety of our people seriously. Morrison frowned. Should we be concerned about the firm's security as well? If Volkov Industries is connected to organized crime, we'll be providing security assessments for everyone involved in tonight's events, Agent Martinez assured him. Petrov's arrest will send a message back to his associates, but our experience suggests they're more likely to cut their losses and abandon this particular operation than to retaliate. David nodded, but his mind was already working through contingencies. Emma's safety would always be his primary concern, and any decision about consulting work would have to factor in potential risks to her. I'd like to review the security protocols before making a final commitment, he said. Emma's been through enough medical uncertainty, I won't add personal safety concerns to her stress. Of course, Agent Martinez replied. We'll have a complete briefing prepared by tomorrow evening. Sarah Chen had been working quietly on her laptop throughout the conversation, but now she looked up with an expression of amazement. I've been researching Professor Cross's academic publications, she said. David, your work on Eastern European corporate crime structures has been cited in over 200 legal cases and policy papers. You're not just an expert, you're considered one of the leading authorities in your field. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had discussed his academic work that he had almost forgotten the impact it had once had. That was a different lifetime, he said quietly. No, Rachel said firmly. That was your foundation. The expertise that saved us tonight didn't disappear when you changed jobs, it just went underground for a while. Agent Martinez gathered her materials and prepared to leave. Professor Cross, I'll be in touch tomorrow with the consultant paperwork and security briefing. In the meantime, I need you to sign a confidentiality agreement regarding tonight's events. The investigation into Volkov Industries needs to proceed without media attention. As David signed those documents, he felt the surreal quality of the evening settling over him like a dream. 6 hours ago, he had been an invisible janitor pushing a cleaning cart. Now he was consulting with the FBI and being offered lucrative positions with prestigious law firms. But the most surreal part was the change in how people looked at him. The attorneys who had barely acknowledged his existence now hung on his words with respect and attention. It was intoxicating and deeply unsettling at the same time. David, Morrison said as Agent Martinez and her team prepared to depart. I'd like to set up a formal meeting for later this week to discuss the consulting arrangement in detail. Would Thursday evening work for you? Thursday would be fine, David replied. Emma has a lighter treatment schedule that day. As the FBI agents filed out of the conference room, taking with them boxes of evidence, and Viktor Petrov in handcuffs, the space seemed to exhale. The crisis that had consumed the room for hours was finally over, but the implications were just beginning to unfold. Rachel sank into one of the leather chairs, exhaustion finally catching up with her. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been here tonight, if you hadn't spoken up. Someone else would have figured it out eventually, David said, beginning to gather the remaining documents. Would they? Dr. Rodriguez asked pointedly. We had 6 of the city's best lawyers examining these papers for weeks. Multiple translators reviewed them. If you hadn't recognized the specific terminology and structural patterns. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They all understood how close they had come to disaster. Michael Torres had been unusually quiet throughout the evening's revelations, but now he approached David with an expression of curious respect. Can I ask you something personal? David nodded. How do you do it? How do you work night shifts as a janitor when you're capable of the kind of analysis we saw tonight? Doesn't it drive you crazy being so underutilized? The question hit closer to home than Michael probably realized. David thought about the countless nights when he had stared at the ceiling, his mind spinning with unused intellectual energy, while his body ached from physical labor he had never been trained for. You do what you have to do for the people you love, David said simply. Emma needed medical care that required money I didn't have. Night custodial work paid better than adjunct teaching and offered the schedule flexibility I needed. The rest was just adaptation. But the isolation, Sarah pressed. The intellectual isolation, I mean. How did you cope with that? David was quiet for a moment, remembering the long nights when he had felt like his mind was slowly atrophying from disuse. I read medical journals, legal publications, anything I could access online. I told myself it was to stay current in case opportunities arose, but really it was just to remember who I used to be. The honesty in his voice created another pocket of silence in the room. These were people who defined themselves by their intellectual achievements, and the thought of being cut off from meaningful mental stimulation was almost incomprehensible to them. Well, Morrison said finally, if tonight proved anything, it's that you never stopped being who you were. You just went underground for a while. David smiled, feeling something that had been knotted tight in his chest for 3 years finally beginning to loosen. Maybe it's time to come back above ground. As the attorneys began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, David found himself alone with Rachel for the first time since the evening's revelations had begun. She approached him hesitantly, as if unsure how to bridge the gap between the cruelty she had shown earlier and the respect she felt now. "David," she said quietly, "I know I apologized earlier, but I need you to understand how deeply I regret what I said. The way I treated you was inexcusable." "Rachel, no, please let me finish." Her voice was thick with emotion she was struggling to control. "I've been thinking about how many times you've cleaned this office, how many nights you've been invisible to us, and now I know that the whole time you were more qualified than any of us to handle the complex international cases we work on." David studied her face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the professional facade. "You were under tremendous pressure. People say things. That's not an excuse," Rachel interrupted. "The pressure revealed something ugly in me, something I don't like about who I've become in this business. You saved us tonight, not just from the legal consequences, but from our own arrogance." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "I want to make this right. Not just the consulting opportunity, but I want to understand how someone like you ends up invisible for 3 years, in a place where your expertise was desperately needed." David considered her words carefully. The evening had been full of revelations, but perhaps this was the most important one, the recognition that brilliant people could become invisible, not through any failing of their own, but through circumstances that reduced them to economic necessities rather than human potential. "It's easier than you might think," he said finally. "When you're desperate enough, you'll take any work that pays the bills. And once you're there, once you're wearing the uniform and pushing the cart, people stop seeing you as anything else. But surely someone should have recognized." "Who? The night security guards, the other custodial staff?" David's voice was gentle but pointed. "The professional staff leave before we arrive and come in after we're gone. We exist in completely different worlds, even in the same building." Rachel absorbed this understanding dawning in her eyes. "We created a system where someone like you could be right in front of us for years without us ever knowing." "You created a system where someone like me wasn't supposed to exist," David corrected. "People with advanced degrees don't usually end up in custodial work unless something has gone catastrophically wrong in their lives." The weight of this observation settled between them. Rachel was beginning to understand that David's situation wasn't unique. There were probably countless people working in invisible jobs who had capabilities and experiences far beyond what their circumstances suggested. "The consulting arrangement," she said suddenly. "It's not just about hiring you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. We need to be more aware of who's around us, more conscious of the assumptions we make about people based on their job titles." David nodded approvingly. That would be a good outcome from all of this. As they prepared to leave the building, David pushed his cleaning cart one last time down the marble corridor. Tomorrow evening, he would return not as a janitor, but as a consultant, bringing expertise rather than disinfectant to the problems that crossed these desks. But tonight, as he changed out of his custodial uniform in the employee locker room, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. not just for financial stability or professional recognition, but for the possibility that Emma's future might include a father who was more than just barely keeping his head above water. The drive home through the pre-dawn streets of Manhattan felt different somehow, as if the city itself had shifted during the night's events. David's phone buzzed with a text from the night nurse at Emma's hospital. "Everything good here. She's sleeping peacefully. See you at morning rounds." As he pulled into his apartment building's parking garage, David realized that tomorrow he would have to tell Emma that Daddy's work was changing. She was too young to understand the complexities of consulting fees and criminal investigations, but she would understand that the worry lines around his eyes might finally start to fade. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave him time to process the enormity of what had happened. In the space of a few hours, his entire future had been rewritten. The question now was whether he could successfully navigate the transition from survival mode back to the professional world where his mind mattered more than his ability to operate a floor buffer. As he quietly unlocked his apartment door, David caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at him was the same one who had left for work 12 hours earlier, but something fundamental had changed. The resignation that had settled into his features over 3 years of invisible labor was gone, replaced by something sharper and more alive. Professor David Cross was coming back from the dead, and tomorrow would be the first day of whatever came next. The morning light filtering through the hospital windows felt different as David walked down the familiar corridor toward Emma's room. For 3 years, these walks had carried the weight of desperation, each step a reminder of mounting bills and dwindling options. Today, something had shifted in the very air around him, though he wasn't quite ready to believe it was real. Emma was awake when he entered, her golden hair spread across the pillow like sunlight, her brown eyes so much like his own, bright with the artificial energy that came from her morning medications. At 7 years old, she had developed an uncanny ability to read her father's moods, and she studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned that adult emotions often predicted changes in her small world. "Daddy looks different today," she announced, her voice carrying that matter-of-fact quality that children use when stating obvious truths that adults try to hide. David settled into the chair beside her bed, the same chair he had occupied every morning for 18 months. "Different how, sweetheart?" Emma tilted her head, considering. "Your eyes aren't doing that worried thing, and you're not checking your phone every 2 minutes." She paused, studying him more carefully. "Did something good happen at work?" The question hit David with unexpected force. He had been so careful to shield Emma from his financial struggles, so determined to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. But children, especially children who spent significant time in hospitals, developed an acute sensitivity to the emotional undercurrents that adults thought they were hiding. "Something very good happened at work," he said carefully. "I might be getting a new job soon. A better job." Emma's face lit up with cautious excitement. "Better how, like more money? Better. Or more fun? Better?" "Both, I think," David replied, his throat tightening with emotion. "It would mean I could use my brain more the way I used to when I was a professor." "Before I got sick," Emma said quietly, and David's heart clenched at the guilt he heard in her voice. "Emma, look at me." David took her small hand in his larger one, feeling the familiar jolt of love and terror that accompanied every moment of physical contact with his daughter. "You getting sick is not why I stopped being a professor. You getting sick is why I learned how strong I could be, how much I could love someone, how far I would go to take care of what matters most." Emma squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. "But you miss it, being a professor. I can tell." The perceptiveness of his 7-year-old daughter never ceased to amaze and humble him. "I do miss it," he admitted, "but I've never regretted the choice I made, not for 1 second. Dr. Sarah Kim entered the room at that moment, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere toward professional efficiency. At 38, she was one of the leading pediatric genetic specialists in the country, and her decision to take Emma's case had been the first piece of genuinely good news David had received since the diagnosis. "Good morning, Emma. How are we feeling today, doctor?" Kim's voice carried the perfect balance of medical authority and genuine warmth that made her so effective with her young patients. "Daddy's getting a new job," Emma announced proudly, as if this news somehow reflected well on her own medical progress. Dr. Kim glanced at David with raised eyebrows. "That's wonderful news. Something in your field." "Consulting work," David said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Academic consulting for legal and law enforcement agencies." "That sounds like it would be a much better fit for your background," Dr. Kim said, settling into the chair on the other side of Emma's bed. "More intellectually stimulating than custodial work, I imagine." David nodded, still struggling to believe that the previous night's events had actually happened. "Dr. Kim, I wanted to ask about Emma's treatment schedule. If this consulting work develops the way I hope it will, I might have more flexibility in my schedule, more resources available for additional treatments." Dr. Kim's expression became carefully neutral, the look she wore when discussing topics that required delicate balance between hope and medical reality. "Let's talk about that after Emma's session today. I have some updates on her progress that we should discuss privately." The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in David's stomach. In 18 months of these conversations, he had learned to read the subtle signs in Dr. Kim's demeanor that indicated whether the news would be encouraging or devastating. Today, her tone suggested something significant, but he couldn't determine which direction it was pointing. Emma, who had developed an equally sophisticated ability to interpret medical conversations, looked between the two adults with concern. "Is everything okay? Are you going to talk about the scary stuff?" Dr. Kim leaned forward, her voice gentle but honest. "We're going to talk about your progress, Emma. Some of it is very good news, and some of it is things we need to keep working on. Nothing scary, just doctor stuff that's easier to explain to grown-ups." Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the weary maturity that came from too much time in hospitals. "Okay, but Daddy, you have to tell me the good parts later." "I promise, sweetheart." As Emma's morning treatment session began, David found himself with 2 hours to kill before Dr. Kim would be available for their private conversation. He walked to the hospital's family lounge, pulled out his laptop, and for the first time in months, began reading legal journals, not out of desperate hope for future opportunities, but as preparation for work he was actually going to be doing. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "Background check expedited. Clean as expected. Can you meet at 2 p.m. to review FBI files? Federal Building, 26th floor." David stared at the message, feeling the surreal quality of his new reality wash over him again. Yesterday, his biggest professional decision had been which cleaning supplies to order for the next month. Today, he was being invited to review federal criminal investigations. He responded, "Yes, I'll be there. Thank you." Another message came through, this one from Rachel. "James wants to move our meeting to tomorrow morning if possible, 9 a.m. We're eager to formalize the consulting agreement." The speed with which everything was moving felt overwhelming. David had spent 3 years in a holding pattern where each day was essentially identical to the one before. Now suddenly his calendar was filling with meetings and opportunities that could reshape his entire future. His phone rang, interrupting his attempts to process this flood of professional interest. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. David Cross speaking. "Professor Cross, this is Dr. Michael Volkoff from the University of Chicago Law School." The voice was crisp professional with a slight accent that David couldn't immediately place. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I obtained your number from a colleague at Columbia." David's breath caught. Dr. Volkoff, surely the name was a coincidence. "How can I help you, Dr. Volkoff?" "I've been following your academic work for several years, and I recently heard through academic channels that you might be returning to consulting. I have a proposition that might interest you." The timing felt too convenient, too coincidental. David's newly reawakened paranoia kicked in, a skill set he had developed during his years of researching criminal organizations that apparently hadn't atrophied during his custodial hiatus. "What kind of proposition?" David asked carefully. "A research collaboration. I'm working on a paper about the intersection of legitimate business practices and organized crime in Eastern Europe. Your expertise in Russian corporate structures would be invaluable to the project." David's mind raced. After 18 months of no academic contact whatsoever, he was suddenly hearing from University of Chicago the day after exposing a Russian money laundering operation. The coincidence was either remarkable or deeply suspicious. Dr. Volkov, could you tell me how you heard that I was returning to consulting? As of yesterday, I hadn't made any public announcements about career changes. There was a pause on the line just long enough to confirm David's suspicions. Academic networks, you know how quickly word travels in our small community. Of course, David said smoothly. Dr. Volkov, I'm very interested in your research proposal. Could you send me some details via email? My schedule is quite complicated right now, but I'd love to review your project outline. Certainly, I'll send something over today. After ending the call, David immediately dialed Agent Martinez's number. Agent Martinez, this is David Cross. I just received a call that I think you should know about. What kind of call? David recounted the conversation with Dr. Michael Volkov, noting the timing and the suspicious coincidences. Agent Martinez listened without interruption, and when he finished, her response was immediate and sharp. Professor Cross, do not respond to any emails from this Dr. Volkov, and do not provide any information about your consulting work or your involvement in our investigation. We'll be checking on this individual immediately. You think it's connected to last night? I think the timing is too convenient to ignore. Russian organized crime networks are sophisticated, and they have extensive resources for gathering intelligence about people who pose threats to their operations. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Should I be concerned about Emma's safety? We're going to upgrade our security recommendations immediately. I'll have a team at the hospital within the hour to assess the situation and implement protective measures. The casual normalcy of his morning conversation with Emma suddenly felt precious and fragile. David realized that his decision to help expose the Volkov Industries operation had potentially put his daughter at risk, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. Agent Martinez, if there's any chance that Emma could be in danger, I need to reconsider my involvement in this investigation. Professor Cross, I understand your concern, and I want to assure you that protecting your daughter is our highest priority. But I also need you to understand that these organizations don't typically abandon operations because one person withdraws. You've already seen their documents. You already know their methods. From their perspective, you're already a threat whether you continue helping us or not. The brutal logic of Agent Martinez's statement hit David like a punch to the stomach. There was no going back to invisibility, no retreating to the safety of anonymity. The moment he had spoken up in that conference room, he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What do you recommend? Full cooperation with our investigation, aggressive prosecution of the criminal network, and comprehensive protection for you and Emma until the threats are neutralized. Half measures won't keep you safe, only completely dismantling their operation will. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a decision that would affect not just his own future, but Emma's safety and well-being. How long are we talking about for the investigation, I mean? These cases typically take 18 to 24 months to fully prosecute, but the acute danger period is usually much shorter, a few weeks, while they assess the threat and decide on their response. David thought about Emma's treatment schedule, about the 18 months of gene therapy that still lay ahead, about the impossibility of keeping a 7-year-old safe while maintaining any semblance of normal life. I need to discuss this with Dr. Kim, he said finally. Emma's medical team needs to be aware of potential security concerns. Absolutely. We'll coordinate with hospital security and make sure everyone involved in Emma's care understands the situation. After ending the call with Agent Martinez, David sat in the family lounge staring at his phone, trying to process how quickly his life had become complicated. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been making rent while covering Emma's medical expenses. Now he was dealing with federal investigations, organized crime threats, and security protocols. Dr. Kim appeared in the lounge doorway, her expression serious but not alarmed. David, Emma's session went very well today. Are you ready to talk? They found a private consultation room, and Dr. Kim closed the door before settling into the chair across from David. Her demeanor was different from their usual post-session discussions, more focused, more intense. David, I've been reviewing Emma's test results from the past month, and I have some significant news to share. David's heart rate spiked. Good significant or bad significant? Very good, significant, Dr. Kim said, allowing herself a small smile. The gene therapy is working better than we had hoped. Emma's mitochondrial function has improved by 40% since we started treatment, and her secondary symptoms are beginning to resolve. David felt the room spin slightly. What does that mean practically? It means that if this rate of progress continues, we might be able to reduce the treatment schedule within 6 months. Instead of daily sessions, we could potentially move to weekly maintenance treatments. The implications hit David like a wave. Reduced treatment schedule meant more flexibility, less time tied to the hospital, more opportunities to rebuild his professional life. But more importantly, it meant Emma was getting better. Is she going to be okay? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Kim's smile broadened. David, I believe Emma is going to live a completely normal life. The improvements we're seeing suggest that the gene therapy is not just managing her condition, but potentially correcting it. David put his head in his hands, overwhelmed by relief so intense it felt like physical pain. 3 years of constant fear of watching his brilliant daughter struggle with fatigue and weakness, of wondering if every good day might be one of the last, all of it was finally beginning to lift. How sure are you? He asked, looking up at Dr. Kim through tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. In medicine, we never say 100% certain, but I'm more optimistic about Emma's prognosis than I've been at any point since her diagnosis. The genetic markers we're tracking show consistent improvement, and her response to treatment has exceeded our most hopeful projections. David sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing this news that changed everything. Emma was going to be okay. His daughter, his brilliant, brave, impossibly strong daughter, was going to live a normal life. Dr. Kim, I need to tell you something about our security situation, he said, finally remembering Agent Martinez's warning about keeping Emma's medical team informed. Dr. Kim listened intently as David explained the events of the previous night, the FBI investigation, and the potential threat from Russian organized crime. Her expression grew increasingly serious as he spoke. David, this is clearly a complex situation, but I want you to know that the hospital has extensive security protocols for protecting patients whose families face external threats. We've handled similar cases involving witness protection, domestic violence, and organized crime. What would that involve for Emma? Restricted access to her room, security personnel, and the pediatric ward, coordination with federal agents. The most important thing is that Emma's treatment won't be interrupted regardless of what security measures we need to implement. David nodded, grateful for Dr. Kim's professional calm in the face of circumstances that seemed surreal to him. How much should I tell Emma about the security situation? Children her age handle uncertainty better when they have age-appropriate information. I'd suggest explaining that Daddy's new job requires some extra safety precautions, but that the precautions are just being careful, not because anything bad is happening. As they prepared to leave the consultation room, Dr. Kim turned back to David with an expression of genuine admiration. David, I've worked with hundreds of families dealing with serious childhood illnesses. The strength and dedication you've shown over the past 18 months has been extraordinary. Emma is lucky to have a father who was willing to sacrifice everything for her well-being. I didn't sacrifice anything, David said quietly. I just chose what mattered most. When David returned to Emma's room, she was sitting up in bed working on a drawing, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The picture showed 2 figures standing in front of a large building, one tall, one small, both smiling. That's you and me at your new job, Emma explained, holding up the drawing. I made you look smart and important because that's how you are in your brain. David sat on the edge of her bed, studying the picture with the intensity it deserved. Emma, how would you feel about having some extra security people around for a while, just being extra careful while Daddy gets used to his new job? Emma looked at him with those 2 knowing brown eyes. Like bodyguards? Sort of. More like extra careful people who make sure everything stays safe. Will they be nice? Yes, sweetheart. And they won't interfere with your treatment or your daily routine. They'll just be around to make sure everything goes smoothly. Emma nodded, accepting this explanation with the adaptability that had carried her through 18 months of medical uncertainty. Can I still draw pictures for them? I think they'd love that. At 2 p.m., David found himself in the federal building's 26th floor, surrounded by case files that painted a picture of criminal organization far more extensive than he had imagined. Agent Martinez sat across from him at a conference table covered with documents, photographs, and financial records. "Professor Cross, what you uncovered last night was just one tentacle of a much larger operation." She began opening a thick folder. Volkov Industries has been operating in North America for 7 years, establishing what we believe are hundreds of shell companies and fraudulent partnerships. David studied the organizational charts spread before him, his academic mind automatically beginning to map the relationships and structures. This is incredibly sophisticated. The legal framework alone would require expertise in multiple jurisdictions. Exactly, which is why your background is so valuable to us. We've been trying to understand their operational structure for 18 months without making significant progress. Agent Martinez pulled out a series of financial documents. These are some of their previous transactions. Can you see patterns that we might have missed? David spent the next hour reviewing documents, his trained eye picking up subtleties that had escaped the FBI's financial analysts. The patterns that emerged painted a picture of an organization that had been systematically infiltrating legitimate American businesses for nearly a decade. "They're not just laundering money," he said finally. "They're building infrastructure for permanent expansion into U.S. markets. These shell companies aren't temporary. They're designed to become self-sustaining legitimate businesses that can operate independently while providing ongoing services to the criminal organization." Agent Martinez leaned forward intently. "What kind of services?" "Money movement, obviously, but also information gathering, legal protection, political influence. They're building a shadow version of legitimate business infrastructure that can support much larger criminal operations." "How much larger?" David pointed to a series of corporate filings. "If these projections are accurate, they're planning to move over $1 billion through North American operations within the next 2 years. But the money laundering is almost secondary to the infrastructure development." Agent Martinez made notes furiously. "Professor Cross, this level of analysis is exactly what we needed. Would you be willing to review their complete case file? It's extensive, probably 40 hours of document review, but your insights could be crucial to understanding the full scope of their operation." David thought about Emma's improved prognosis, about the reduced treatment schedule that would give him more flexibility, about the consulting fees that would provide financial security for the first time in 3 years. "Yes," he said. "I'll review everything you have." As he prepared to leave the federal building, David's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We know who you are now, Professor. Perhaps we should meet to discuss mutual interests." He immediately forwarded the message to Agent Martinez, who responded within minutes. "Do not respond. Protection detail being assigned immediately. We need to accelerate our timeline." Walking back to his car, David found himself scanning the crowds on the street, looking for faces that lingered too long or eyes that watched too intently. The paranoia felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign, because he had lived anonymously for 3 years. Familiar, because his academic research had taught him how dangerous organizations like this could be when they felt threatened. His phone rang as he reached his car. Rachel's name appeared on the caller ID. "David, I hope you don't mind me calling, but James is eager to formalize our consulting arrangement as quickly as possible. Given what happened last night, we want to make sure you have financial security while you're working with the FBI." "Rachel, I appreciate that, but I should warn you that my involvement in this investigation might create security complications for the firm. We're aware of the potential risks, and we've already implemented additional security measures. David, what you did last night saved us from catastrophe. The least we can do is provide support while you help law enforcement pursue these criminals." David felt a wave of gratitude for Rachel's loyalty and professional integrity. 24 hours ago, she had mocked him mercilessly. Now she was offering to stand with him against organized crime. "The FBI wants me to review a massive case file," he said. "It could be weeks of intensive document analysis." "Perfect. That's exactly the kind of work we want to support. David, I've been thinking about last night about how someone with your expertise ended up invisible for 3 years. We want to make sure that never happens again, not just for you, but for anyone else who might be in similar circumstances." What do you mean? James is proposing a new consulting program for people with advanced degrees who are working in non-professional jobs due to personal circumstances. Economic hardship, medical crises, family obligations, situations that force brilliant people into survival mode. David was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications of what Rachel was suggesting. That would be really meaningful. It would be called the David Cross Fellowship Program, Rachel said quietly, if you're comfortable with that. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. The idea that his experience could be transformed into something that helped others in similar situations felt like redemption for every humiliating moment of the past 3 years. I'd be honored, he said finally. As David drove home through Manhattan traffic, he thought about the conversation he would have with Emma that evening. He would tell her about the good news from Dr. Kim, about the consulting opportunities that would provide financial security, about the possibility that their lives were finally moving in a positive direction. He wouldn't tell her about the threatening text message, or the FBI protection detail, or the fact that helping to expose a criminal organization had put them both in potential danger. There would be time for those conversations later when the immediate threats had been addressed. For now, it was enough to know that Emma was getting better, that his professional life was being resurrected, and that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing at the right moment could change everything. The man who had been invisible for 3 years was finally stepping back into the light, and whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the resources and support to protect what mattered most. As he pulled into his apartment building's parking garage, David allowed himself to believe, for the first time in years, that their story might have a genuinely happy ending. The road ahead was uncertain and potentially dangerous, but it was also filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Emma was waiting for him with another drawing, this one showing a man in a suit standing beside a little girl who was running and playing, both of them surrounded by sunshine. The caption, written in careful 7-year-old handwriting, read, "Daddy and Emma, when everything gets better." David taped the picture to their refrigerator next to dozens of others, each one a small act of faith in a future that was finally beginning to feel possible. The threatening text message had changed everything, transforming David's apartment from a sanctuary into a potential target. As he sat at his kitchen table that evening, watching Emma color at the other end, while FBI agent Jennifer Walsh conducted a security assessment of their home. The surreal nature of his new reality felt overwhelming. Agent Walsh was methodical and professional, checking windows, examining sightlines, evaluating potential vulnerabilities with the practiced eye of someone who had done this countless times before. She was younger than David had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short auburn hair and the kind of alert stillness that suggested extensive tactical training. "The building has good natural security," she reported, settling into a chair across from David. "Limited access point security cameras in the lobby, and your 15th floor location makes surveillance difficult. We'll station an agent in the lobby overnight and have plainclothes surveillance on the street." Emma looked up from her coloring book, her brown eyes curious, but not frightened. "Are you a police officer?" Agent Walsh smiled, her stern, professional demeanor softening in the presence of a child. "Something like that, sweetheart. I'm here to make sure you and your daddy stay safe while he helps with an important case." "Like on TV?" Emma asked, clearly more excited than worried by this development. "A little bit like TV," Agent Walsh confirmed, "but probably more boring. Mostly I'll just be around making sure everything stays normal and peaceful." David watched this interaction with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. Emma's resilience continued to amaze him, but he worried about the psychological impact of living under protection, of having her childhood further complicated by adult concerns she shouldn't have to understand. "Agent Walsh," David said quietly, "how long do these protection details typically last?" "It varies depending on the nature of the threat and how quickly we can neutralize it. In cases involving organized crime, we usually see resolution within 4 to 6 weeks. The immediate danger period is typically much shorter." David nodded, trying to process a timeline that would take them through Emma's next round of medical evaluations and into the critical phase of her treatment schedule. "Will this interfere with Emma's hospital visits?" We'll coordinate with hospital security to ensure seamless protection during all medical appointments. Emma's treatment schedule takes absolute priority. As Agent Walsh continued her security briefing, David's phone buzzed with multiple messages. The first was from Agent Martinez. FBI task force meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Bring your analysis of the financial documents. The second was from Rachel. James moved our meeting to 8 a.m. tomorrow. He wants to fast-track the consulting agreement given the current situation. The third was from Dr. Kim. David, I've reviewed the security protocols with hospital administration. Everything is arranged for Emma's continued treatment. Call me if you have concerns. The rapid-fire coordination required by his new circumstances felt like drinking from a fire hose. For 3 years, David's life had operated on the simple rhythm of work, hospital, home, repeat. Now every hour seemed to require multiple high-stakes decisions and complex scheduling. Daddy, Emma said, setting down her crayon, is your new job dangerous? The question cut straight to the heart of David's deepest fears. He had spent 3 years protecting Emma from adult worries, maintaining the illusion that her father had everything under control, even when he was barely keeping his head above water. Now, he was faced with explaining a situation that he didn't fully understand himself. Sometimes grown-up jobs involve helping with difficult situations, he said carefully. The police officers and FBI agents are very good at keeping people safe while they do important work. But you're not a police officer, Emma said with the logical precision that made her father's heart swell with pride even in moments of stress. No, sweetheart. I'm helping them understand some complicated legal documents. It's like being a translator, but for business papers instead of languages. Emma considered this explanation seriously. So you're like a detective, but for papers. That's a very good way to put it. Agent Walsh had been listening to this conversation with professional interest. Emma, your daddy is helping us catch some very bad people who are trying to steal money and hurt other families. That makes him a hero in my book. Emma beamed at this characterization, and David felt his throat tighten with emotion. The idea that his daughter might see him as heroic, rather than simply desperate, felt like a gift he didn't deserve. The evening routine that followed was surreal in its normalcy. Emma had her bath, insisted on reading 2 chapters of her current favorite book, and demanded her usual bedtime story. The presence of FBI protection seemed to fade into the background of her 7-year-old consciousness with remarkable ease. But after Emma fell asleep, David found himself sitting in his living room with Agent Walsh discussing threat assessments and security protocols that made his new reality feel like someone else's life. Professor Cross, Agent Walsh said, I've reviewed your file and I want you to understand that we take these threats very seriously. The organization you've exposed has significant resources and a history of retaliating against people who interfere with their operations. David felt a chill settle in his stomach. What kind of retaliation? Usually intimidation, first threatening messages, surveillance attempts to disrupt your daily routine. If that doesn't work, they sometimes escalate to property damage or direct confrontation. And if that doesn't work, Agent Walsh's expression grew grim. They have been known to target family members, particularly children, as leverage to force cooperation or silence. The casual mention of threats against Emma hit David like a physical blow. Agent Walsh, I need to know honestly, should I be withdrawing from this investigation to protect my daughter? Professor Cross, I understand your concern, but you need to understand that withdrawal might not guarantee safety at this point. You've already seen their operational structure. You've already provided analysis that could damage their organization. From their perspective, the threat you represent doesn't disappear if you stop actively helping us. David absorbed this brutal logic, feeling the weight of decisions that had seemed clear-cut 24 hours earlier. So, what do you recommend? Full cooperation with the investigation, aggressive prosecution that dismantles their entire network, and comprehensive protection until the threat is eliminated. Half measures leave you vulnerable indefinitely. As Agent Walsh settled in for her overnight watch in the lobby, David found himself unable to sleep. He stood at his living room window looking down at the street below, wondering if any of the late-night pedestrians or parked cars represented surveillance from people who now considered him an enemy. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Agent Martinez. Additional intelligence suggests accelerated timeline. Organization is planning to abandon U.S. operations and liquidate assets within 30 days. Your continued analysis critical to preventing their escape. David stared at the message, understanding that the window for bringing these criminals to justice was closing rapidly. If they managed to liquidate their assets and abandon their American operations, they would essentially escape consequences for crimes that had damaged countless victims. The next morning's routine felt like a carefully choreographed dance of security protocols. Agent Walsh escorted them to the hospital where Emma's treatment session proceeded normally, despite the presence of additional security personnel. Dr. Kim had seamlessly integrated the protection requirements into Emma's medical routine, and Emma herself seemed to view the extra attention as an adventure rather than a source of anxiety. "Daddy," Emma said as her IV drip was being prepared. "After my treatment gets better, will you still have the exciting job?" David considered the question carefully. The consulting opportunities with Morrison Hayes and Associates and the FBI represented not just financial security, but intellectual fulfillment he had forgotten was possible. The prospect of returning to meaningful work of using his expertise to solve complex problems felt like reclaiming a part of himself that had been dormant for 3 years. "I think so, sweetheart. If everything goes well, Daddy might get to be Professor Cross again, but in a different way." "Good," Emma said with satisfaction. "I like it when you look smart and important instead of tired and worried." The observation hit David with unexpected force. He had thought he was successfully hiding his struggles from Emma, but children, especially children who spend significant time in hospitals, develop acute sensitivity to adult emotional states. Emma, even when Daddy looked tired and worried, was "I still a good daddy." Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "You're the best daddy in the whole world. You just looked like you forgot that you're smart and important too." Dr. Kim, who had been listening to this conversation while checking Emma's vital signs, caught David's eye and smiled. "Children have a remarkable ability to see through to what matters most," she said quietly. After Emma's treatment session, David drove to Morrison Hayes and Associates for his 8 a.m. meeting with James Morrison. The familiar building looked different now. Instead of representing a world he was excluded from, it had become a place where his expertise was valued and needed. Rachel met him in the lobby, her professional demeanor warmer than he had ever seen it. "David, thank you for coming in despite everything that's happening. James is eager to formalize our consulting arrangement as quickly as possible." As they rode the elevator to the executive conference room, Rachel's expression grew more serious. "I want you to know that the entire firm stands behind you in this situation. What you did for us, exposing that criminal operation, it goes far beyond a normal consultant relationship." The executive conference room was the same space where David had cleaned trash bins and emptied ashtrays for 3 years, but now he was walking in as an invited participant rather than invisible labor. James Morrison stood to greet him, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Professor Cross, I've had 45 years to observe courage in various forms, but what you did Tuesday night was extraordinary. You risked your own safety to protect people who had treated you poorly." David shook Morrison's hand, feeling the weight of recognition he hadn't experienced since leaving academia. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate that, but I was just doing what felt right." "Which is exactly why we want to work with you on a permanent basis," Morrison said, gesturing for David to take a seat at the head of the table. "Rachel, would you review the proposed consulting arrangement?" Rachel opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a formal contract. "David, we're proposing a retainer-based consulting agreement that would provide you with a guaranteed annual income of $400,000, plus additional fees for specific cases that require extensive involvement." David felt his breath catch. $400,000 was more than twice what he had earned as a full professor, enough to cover Emma's medical expenses while providing genuine financial security for the first time in years. The retainer requires availability for consultation on international cases, particularly those involving Eastern European entities, Rachel continued. "But we understand your family obligations take priority, and we've structured the agreement to provide maximum schedule flexibility." Morrison leaned forward intently. Professor Cross, I want to be clear about what we're offering. This isn't charity or compensation for past treatment. Your expertise has genuine commercial value, and last Tuesday proved that your insights can literally save careers and reputations. David reviewed the contract carefully, his academic training kicking in as he analyzed the terms and conditions. The agreement was remarkably generous, providing not just financial compensation, but also professional respect and intellectual challenge. Mr. Morrison, this is an extraordinary offer, David said finally. But I need to be honest about the current security situation. My involvement in the FBI investigation could potentially create risks for the firm. We're aware of the risks, and we've implemented appropriate security measures, Morrison replied. More importantly, we believe that supporting your work with law enforcement is both the right thing to do and good business practice. Firms that help expose financial crimes earn credibility that pays dividends for decades. Rachel added, David, we've also discussed the fellowship program I mentioned yesterday. The firm's partners voted unanimously to establish the David Cross Fellowship, providing consulting opportunities for people with advanced degrees who are working in non-professional positions due to personal circumstances. The idea that his experience could be transformed into something that helped others in similar situations felt like redemption for every humiliating moment of the past 3 years. I'd be honored to have my name associated with that program. As David signed the consulting agreement, he felt a profound shift in his identity. For 3 years, he had been David the janitor, struggling to survive and protect his daughter. Now he was Dr. David Cross again, Professor Cross, a respected consultant whose expertise was valued and needed. His phone buzzed with a message from Agent Martinez. Task force meeting in 1 hour. Bring signed consulting agreement. We want Morrison Hayes formally involved in the investigation as your sponsoring organization. The FBI task force meeting was held in a secure conference room in the federal building with representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies around a table covered with case files, financial documents, and organizational charts. Agent Martinez introduced David to the assembled team with visible pride. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor David Cross, the academic consultant whose analysis broke open the Volkov Industries case, she announced. Professor Cross has agreed to serve as primary consultant on document analysis and organizational structure assessment. Assistant Director Robert Chen of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division stood to address the room. Professor Cross, your preliminary analysis suggested that Volkov Industries is planning to liquidate U.S. assets within 30 days. Can you elaborate on that assessment? David approached the whiteboard, feeling the familiar energy of academic presentation flowing through him. For the first time in 3 years, he was in his element, using his expertise to solve complex problems for an engaged audience. The corporate structures I reviewed indicate a systematic preparation for asset liquidation. He began drawing organizational charts on the whiteboard. Shell companies are being dissolved in specific sequences. Money is being moved to jurisdictions with limited extradition treaties, and legitimate business partnerships are being terminated with carefully worded liability limitations. How confident are you in this timeline? Asked Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez from the Treasury Department. Very confident. The pattern is consistent with organized crime asset protection protocols I've studied in academic research. They're not just closing down operations, they're implementing a complete strategic withdrawal designed to protect core leadership and preserve operational capacity for future ventures. Assistant Director Chen studied the organizational chart David had drawn. Professor Cross, if they succeed in liquidating their assets and withdrawing from U.S. operations, what are the chances of eventual prosecution? Minimal, David said bluntly. Once they're operating from jurisdictions with limited law enforcement cooperation, building cases becomes exponentially more difficult. This 30-day window is likely our only opportunity for meaningful prosecution. The room fell silent as the implications of David's assessment settled over the assembled law enforcement officers. Agent Martinez spoke first. Professor Cross, we need your help to analyze their complete operational structure and identify vulnerabilities we can exploit to prevent their withdrawal. Are you prepared for that level of involvement? David thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed that morning, trusting him to make the right decisions for their future. He thought about the other families that had been victimized by this organization, about the children who might be trafficked if these criminals escaped justice. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to stop them." Assistant Director Chen nodded approvingly. "Professor Cross, effective immediately. You're being designated as a special consultant to this task force. Your analysis will guide our operational strategy for the next 30 days. As the meeting concluded and assignments were distributed to various agencies, David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The decisions he made over the next month would affect not just his own family's safety, but the outcome of an investigation that could prevent significant harm to countless other families. Agent Martinez approached him as the room emptied. "Professor Cross, I want you to understand what you've taken on. This organization has resources, connections, and a willingness to use violence that makes them extremely dangerous. But they also have vulnerabilities that your expertise can help us exploit." "What kind of vulnerabilities?" "Their success depends on maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. The more we understand their structure, the more precisely we can target their weak points without giving them time to adapt or escape." David nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge combined with the sobering awareness of real-world consequences. "Agent Martinez, I'll need access to their complete financial records, all corporate filings, and any communications intercepts you've obtained. Everything will be delivered to Morrison Hayes this afternoon. We're setting up a secure workspace there so you can analyze documents while maintaining your consulting relationship with the firm." As David left the federal building, his phone rang with a call from Dr. Kim. "David, I have more good news about Emma's progress," she said, her voice bright with professional satisfaction. "The latest test results show continued improvement in all key markers. We're now confident that we can reduce her treatment schedule to 3 sessions per week starting next month." The news felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Reduced treatment schedule meant more flexibility for his consulting work, less time tied to the hospital, and most importantly, tangible evidence that Emma was continuing to improve. "Dr. Kim, how significant is this improvement?" "Very significant. At this rate of progress, we could potentially move to weekly maintenance treatments within 6 months. David, I believe Emma is going to make a complete recovery." David felt tears he had been holding back for months, finally spilling over. Complete recovery. The words he had been afraid to hope for, the possibility he had been afraid to even consider, was finally becoming real. "Thank you," he whispered into the phone. "Thank you for everything you've done for her." David, Emma's recovery is as much about your dedication as it is about medical treatment. The stability and love you've provided during her illness has been crucial to her healing process. As David drove back to the hospital to pick up Emma after her afternoon session, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation his life had undergone in just 72 hours. Tuesday night, he had been an invisible janitor struggling to make rent while paying for medical treatments he could barely afford. Now he was a federal consultant with a lucrative private practice working to dismantle an international criminal organization, while his daughter recovered from a genetic condition that had once seemed hopeless. Emma was waiting for him in the pediatric lounge, working on another drawing. This one showed a man in a suit standing beside a desk covered with papers, while a little girl played nearby with toys and books. "That's you at your new job," Emma explained proudly. "I made sure you looked very important and smart." David studied the drawing carefully, seeing himself through his daughter's eyes, not as the desperate, struggling man he had been, but as the capable, important person she had always believed him to be. "Emma, what do you think about Daddy having such an important job?" Emma considered the question with 7-year-old seriousness. "I think it's good that other people finally figured out how smart you are, but I always knew." As they drove home through Manhattan traffic, Emma chattering about her day and her artwork and her plans for when she felt completely better, David allowed himself to believe that their story was finally moving toward the happy ending his daughter deserved. The road ahead was still uncertain and potentially dangerous, but for the first time in 3 years, David Cross, father, professor, and federal consultant, felt equipped to handle whatever challenges awaited them. He had his expertise, his professional support network, his daughter's improving health, and most importantly, the knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments can transform into opportunities for redemption and renewal. The man who had been invisible for 3 years was finally stepping fully into the light, ready to use his considerable abilities to protect not just his own family, but all the families that could be saved by bringing dangerous criminals to justice. The countdown began in earnest the following Monday morning when David discovered that the Volkov organization was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Sitting in his new office at Morrison Hayes & Associates, a space that had been hastily converted from a storage room but felt like a palace compared to his custodial closet, David stared at financial documents that painted a picture of accelerated liquidation. "Agent Martinez," he said into his secure phone, "they're not waiting 30 days. Based on these asset transfers, I estimate they have maybe 2 weeks before their U.S. operations are completely dissolved." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Professor Cross, are you certain about that timeline? Look at transaction 47B through 51C. David said, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard as he pulled up the relevant documents. Shell companies in Delaware are being dissolved in rapid succession, and the money is flowing to Cayman subsidiaries that were established specifically for asset protection. This is emergency liquidation, not planned withdrawal. What triggered the acceleration? David leaned back in his chair, processing patterns that his academic training had taught him to recognize. They know we're closing in. Somewhere in their organization, someone has concluded that their U.S. operations are compromised beyond recovery. Through his office window, David could see Rachel in the main conference room leading a strategy session with 3 junior associates. The sight of her commanding respect and attention reminded him of how dramatically their relationship had transformed over the past week. The woman who had once mocked him now sought his advice on complex international cases and deferred to his expertise with genuine respect. Professor Cross, Agent Martinez continued, if you're right about the timeline, we need to move immediately. Can you identify which assets they're prioritizing for protection? David pulled up a series of spreadsheets, his mind automatically organizing the financial data into meaningful patterns. They're protecting 3 categories of assets: core operational funds, key personnel, escape routes, and what appears to be blackmail material on American business leaders. Blackmail material. Corporate document storage facilities in Virginia and Maryland. Based on the insurance valuations and security expenditures, these facilities contain something extremely valuable that isn't standard financial records. Agent Martinez was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Professor Cross, we're going to need search warrants for those facilities immediately. Can you provide detailed analysis supporting probable cause? I'll have it to you within 2 hours. As David began preparing the legal analysis that would justify federal search warrants, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma's day nurse. Emma asking when Daddy will be home. Should I tell her about dinner plans? David smiled, remembering that he had promised Emma they would cook dinner together that evening, her first attempt at making lasagna a project she had been planning for days. The mundane normalcy of his daughter's concerns felt precious in the context of his current work, dismantling international criminal organizations. He texted back, tell her Daddy will be home by 5 p.m. for our cooking adventure. Nothing will interfere with lasagna night. The promise felt important not just to Emma, but to himself. For 3 years, work had been something he endured to pay for Emma's medical care. Now, for the first time, he was engaged in work that felt meaningful and intellectually fulfilling, but he was determined not to let professional satisfaction interfere with his primary role as Emma's father. Rachel knocked on his office door carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression of concerned curiosity. David, I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation with Agent Martinez. Is everything all right? David gestured for her to sit down, grateful for the opportunity to discuss the case with someone who understood both the legal and personal implications. The timeline is accelerating. We have maybe 2 weeks to prevent these criminals from escaping justice entirely. What do you need from us? The question was simple, but the implications were profound. Rachel wasn't just asking about professional support, she was offering the full resources of Morrison Hayes & Associates in service of bringing criminals to justice. Legal research support for federal warrant applications, David said. The analysis I'm preparing needs to meet extremely high standards of evidence. and I could use help from associates who specialize in federal criminal procedure. Consider it done, Rachel said immediately. Michael Torres has extensive experience with federal criminal cases, and Sarah Chen's background in international law could be invaluable. As Rachel left to coordinate legal support, David's phone rang with a call from Dr. Kim. "David, I have Emma's latest test results and I wanted to share them with you immediately." Dr. Kim's voice carried undisguised excitement. "The improvement in her mitochondrial function has exceeded our most optimistic projections. We're now confident that Emma will achieve complete recovery within 6 months." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Complete recovery within 6 months. The words represented the end of a nightmare that had consumed 3 years of their lives. "Dr. Kim, what does complete recovery mean, practically?" "It means Emma will live a completely normal life. No restrictions on physical activity, no ongoing medical supervision beyond routine checkups, no limitations on her future plans. David, your daughter is going to be able to do anything she wants to do." David closed his eyes, overwhelmed by relief so intense it felt like physical pain. Emma would be normal. She would be healthy. She would have the childhood and future that her illness had threatened to steal. "How sure are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "As sure as medical science allows us to be. The genetic therapy has been more successful than we dared to hope. Emma's case will likely become a model for treating other children with similar conditions." After ending the call with Dr. Kim, David sat in his office for several minutes, absorbing news that changed everything. Emma's recovery meant that the financial pressures that had driven him from academia were finally lifting. The consulting income from Morrison Hayes & Associates, combined with his FBI work, provided more than enough resources to ensure Emma's continued health and their long-term financial security. But more importantly, Emma's recovery meant that the sacrifice he had made, walking away from tenure, from research he loved, from the identity he had spent years building, had been worth it. His daughter would live a normal life because he had been willing to give up his own. Michael Torres appeared in his doorway carrying a thick folder of legal documents. "Professor Cross, Rachel asked me to assist with your warrant applications. I've pulled together federal precedents for probable cause standards in organized crime investigations." David gestured for Michael to sit down, grateful for professional support that allowed him to focus on analysis rather than legal research. "Michael, I need to establish probable cause for searching document storage facilities that we believe contain blackmail material. The challenge is proving criminal intent based purely on financial transaction patterns." Michael opened his folder, revealing carefully organized case law and procedural guidelines. "Professor Cross, your academic background actually provides significant credibility for this type of analysis. Federal judges take expert testimony very seriously, especially from professors with established reputations in the relevant field." As they worked together on the warrant applications, David found himself enjoying the collaborative intellectual process for the first time in years. The academic discussions he had missed, the rigorous analysis of complex problems, the satisfaction of using his expertise to solve real-world challenges, all of it was flowing back into his life, like water returning to a dried riverbed. Sarah Chen joined them an hour later, bringing additional research on international asset protection schemes. "Professor Cross, I've been reviewing similar cases involving Russian organized crime, and there's a pattern of using American business leaders as unwitting accomplices through compromising information." "What kind of compromising information?" David asked. "Usually evidence of minor financial irregularities or personal indiscretions that wouldn't normally result in criminal charges, but could destroy reputations if made public. The criminal organization leverages this information to ensure cooperation and silence." David absorbed this information, understanding that the stakes of their investigation extended far beyond financial crimes. If the Volkov organization had been systematically compromising American business leaders, their escape would leave dozens of innocent people vulnerable to ongoing extortion. "Sarah, this suggests that preventing their escape isn't just about prosecuting past crimes, it's about protecting ongoing victims." "Exactly, which should strengthen our warrant applications significantly." By 4 p.m., David had completed comprehensive legal analysis supporting search warrants for 3 document storage facilities. The work had required every skill he had developed during his academic career, combined with practical insights gained from his consulting experience. As he prepared to submit the analysis to Agent Martinez, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from using his intellectual capabilities to their fullest extent. His phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Daddy, I got all the ingredients for lasagna ready. When are you coming home?" David smiled, remembering his promise about being home by 5 p.m. He quickly saved his work, gathered his materials, and prepared to leave the office. Rachel intercepted him in the hallway. "David, how did the warrant applications go?" "Strong probable cause, solid legal foundation, and compelling evidence of ongoing criminal activity," David replied. "Agent Martinez should have everything she needs to obtain federal search warrants." "And how are you holding up under all this pressure?" The question was simple, but David could hear genuine concern in Rachel's voice. Over the past week, their professional relationship had deepened into something approaching friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. "I'm doing better than I've done in years," David said honestly. "For the first time since Emma got sick, I feel like I'm using my capabilities to their fullest extent. It's intellectually fulfilling in a way I had forgotten was possible." Rachel smiled, but her expression carried a note of sadness. "David, I keep thinking about the 3 years you spent cleaning our offices, invisible to everyone who should have recognized your capabilities. I can't help but feel that we failed you not just personally, but professionally." David considered her words carefully. The pain of those 3 years, the humiliation, the intellectual isolation, the constant fear about Emma's future was real and couldn't be erased by current success. But those experiences had also taught him lessons about resilience, about what really mattered, about the strength that could be found in love and determination. "Rachel, those 3 years were the most difficult of my life," he said finally. "But they also taught me things I never would have learned in academia. I learned that my value as a person isn't determined by my job title or professional recognition. I learned that I'm capable of sacrificing anything for Emma's well-being. And I learned that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives can become the foundation for something better." Rachel nodded, absorbing this perspective. "David, I want you to know that the David Cross Fellowship Program isn't just about helping other people in similar situations. It's about making sure that this firm never again overlooks someone's potential because of their current circumstances." As David drove home through Manhattan traffic, he reflected on the extraordinary week he had experienced. 7 days ago, he had been an invisible janitor pushing a cleaning cart. Tonight, he was driving home from his office at a prestigious law firm, having just completed federal warrant applications that could help dismantle an international criminal organization. But the most extraordinary transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. For the first time in 3 years, David felt like himself again. Not just the brilliant academic he had once been, but a more complete version of that person, tempered by hardship and strengthened by love. Emma was waiting for him in their apartment kitchen, wearing an apron that was comically large for her small frame and surrounded by ingredients for their lasagna project. Her face lit up when she saw him, and David felt the familiar surge of love and gratitude that accompanied every moment with his daughter. "Daddy, I got everything ready. Can we start cooking now?" David looked at the carefully arranged ingredients, at his daughter's eager face, at the normal domestic scene that had once seemed impossible during the darkest days of her illness. "Absolutely, sweetheart. Let's make the best lasagna in Manhattan." As they worked together in the kitchen, Emma chattering about her day and her plans for when she felt completely better, David's phone buzzed with updates from Agent Martinez. The warrant applications had been approved. Federal agents were preparing to execute searches of the document storage facilities. The investigation was moving into its final phase. But David's attention was focused entirely on Emma, on the simple pleasure of cooking dinner with his healthy, happy daughter. The criminal investigation, the consulting fees, the professional recognition, all of it was important, but it was secondary to this moment, to this relationship that had been the driving force behind every decision he had made for the past 3 years. "Daddy," Emma said as they layered cheese and sauce, when I get completely better. What will you do with your new job? David considered the question while helping Emma spread ricotta cheese evenly across the pasta. I think I'll keep helping people solve complicated problems. Maybe I'll teach again someday at a university where you can visit me in my office. Will you still have time to cook dinner with me? Every single night that you want to, David promised. No job will ever be more important than spending time with you. Emma smiled with satisfaction, apparently reassured that her father's professional success wouldn't interfere with their relationship. Good, because I like it when we cook together. As their lasagna baked in the oven, filling the apartment with rich, comforting aromas, David's phone rang with a call from Agent Martinez. Professor Cross, the searches were successful beyond our wildest expectations, she said, her voice bright with professional satisfaction. The document storage facilities contained evidence of systematic blackmail operations targeting over 40 American business leaders. Your analysis was absolutely crucial to obtaining these warrants. David felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that his work had helped protect innocent people from ongoing criminal exploitation. What's the next step? Coordinated arrests across 3 states, asset seizures, and federal charges that will ensure these criminals spend decades in prison. Professor Cross, your involvement in this investigation has been absolutely crucial to its success. As David processed this news, Emma appeared at his side, tugging on his shirt. Daddy, the lasagna is ready. Agent Martinez, I need to have dinner with my daughter, David said, smiling at Emma's excited face. But thank you for everything. This investigation has been the most meaningful work I've done in years. Professor Cross, thank you for your courage in speaking up that night. Without your expertise, these criminals would have escaped justice entirely. As they sat down to eat their homemade lasagna, Emma raised her water glass in a toast. To Daddy's new job, and my getting better. David clinked his glass against hers, feeling overwhelmed by gratitude for the extraordinary transformation their lives had undergone. To new beginnings and second chances. Over the following weeks, as federal arrests dismantled the Volkov criminal organization, and Emma's health continued to improve dramatically, David settled into a routine that felt both familiar and entirely new. His consulting work with Morrison, Hayes & Associates provided intellectual challenge and financial security, while his continued collaboration with federal law enforcement allowed him to use his expertise in service of justice. The David Cross Fellowship Program became operational 2 months later, providing consulting opportunities for people with advanced degrees who were working in non-professional positions due to personal circumstances. The first fellowship recipient was Dr. Maria Santos, a former chemistry professor who had been working as a night security guard to pay for her son's autism therapy. Her expertise in chemical analysis proved invaluable to the firm's pharmaceutical clients. Emma's treatment was reduced to weekly maintenance sessions by spring, and Dr. Kim's predictions about complete recovery proved accurate. By summer, Emma was running, playing, and engaging in all the normal activities of a healthy 8-year-old. The experimental gene therapy that had consumed 3 years of their lives had achieved complete success. On a warm evening in June, David stood in the same conference room where his transformation had begun 8 months earlier. But tonight, instead of pushing a cleaning cart, he was addressing the firm's annual partners meeting, presenting analysis of international corporate crime trends that would guide the firm's practice development for the coming year. Rachel, now a firm managing partner, introduced him with visible pride. Professor David Cross, our senior international consultant and the namesake of our fellowship program that has already helped 12 families transition from survival mode to professional fulfillment. As David presented his analysis to the assembled partners, he caught sight of Emma through the conference room windows. She was sitting in the firm's family lounge working on homework and occasionally looking up to wave at her father. Her presence in the building was no longer unusual. She often came to the office after school, turning David's workspace into an impromptu study hall where she could spend time with her father while he completed his consulting work. The patterns we're seeing in international corporate crime, David told the partners, suggest that legitimate businesses will increasingly need sophisticated analysis to avoid becoming unwitting accomplices to criminal organizations. Our fellowship program provides access to expertise that would otherwise be unavailable, while creating opportunities for brilliant people who have been displaced by personal circumstances. James Morrison, now in his final year before retirement, stood to address the room. Professor Cross's work over the past 8 months has not only enhanced our international practice, but has reminded us of our obligation to recognize talent regardless of where we find it. The David Cross Fellowship represents our commitment to ensuring that financial hardship or personal crisis never again prevents us from accessing the expertise we need. As the meeting concluded and partners gathered for informal conversation, David found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man who had been invisible for 3 years, dismissed and overlooked, despite his considerable capabilities, was now recognized as one of the city's leading experts in international corporate crime. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. Emma ran up to him as he left the conference room, her backpack bouncing as she moved with the energy of complete health. "Daddy, did you tell them about the new case? The one where you helped catch the bad guys who were stealing from hospitals?" David smiled, lifting Emma into a hug that felt like pure joy. "I mentioned it, sweetheart. But I told them the most important thing is that we're working together to make sure other families don't have to go through what we went through." "Good," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty, "because helping people is the best job ever." As they walked home together through the early summer evening, Emma chattering about her plans for the weekend and her excitement about starting 3rd grade in the fall, David reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had transformed their lives. The mockery that had started everything, Rachel's cruel challenge about his salary, had become the catalyst for redemption, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. Rachel had learned to recognize talent regardless of circumstances. James Morrison had established a fellowship program that would help dozens of families, and the FBI had gained a consultant whose expertise had helped dismantle criminal organizations that were harming innocent people. But most importantly, Emma was healthy, happy, and growing up with a father who was finally using his capabilities to their fullest extent, while maintaining his commitment to what mattered most. The evening light filtering through their apartment windows felt different now, warmer somehow, as David helped Emma with her homework, and they planned their weekend activities. For the first time in years, the future felt bright with possibility rather than shadowed by fear. "Daddy," Emma said as they finished her math homework, "I'm proud of you for helping catch the bad guys and for getting your important job back. And I'm proud of you for being brave during all your treatments and for never giving up," David replied, pulling her close for another hug. "We're a good team, aren't we?" Emma said with satisfaction. "The best team in the world," David agreed, feeling the truth of those words settle into his heart like a promise. Outside their apartment windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy, full of stories of struggle and triumph, of second chances and redemption. But inside their home, David Cross, father, professor, consultant, and survivor, sat with his healthy daughter, grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the courage to speak up when it matters most. The man who had been mocked for his circumstances had found his way back to respect through expertise, determination, and the unwavering love that had sustained him through the darkest times. And in doing so, he had discovered that redemption was possible, not just for himself, but for everyone willing to look beyond surface appearances to recognize the extraordinary potential that often hides in the most ordinary places. The story that had begun with cruelty and desperation had become one of hope, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is simply the quiet dignity of being exactly who you are, using your gifts in service of what matters most, and never losing faith that better days are possible for those brave enough to reach for them.